Hi, I'm EJ, this is NonCompete, and this is going to be a bit of a Frankenstein video. I'm cutting it together over a couple of days here. It's going to be rough, bear with me. But this is a response video to a stream that Vaush did a few days ago, attacking one of my wife's comrades, stream partners' videos. I'm talking about Luna of Luna Oi, and she has a video series on dialectical materialism. Vaush did a 2-hour stream going through the video, and I found it to be very disappointing. So that is what this video is about. I know a lot of you are going to be upset that I'm making this video. There are going to be people watching this who are big fans of Vaush, who are going to be inclined to side with Vaush from the beginning. I hope that you will watch this all the way through and hear me out, because I really want you to see the things that I'm about to point out about Vaush and his rhetorical strategy. But I also know that there are people who hate Vaush who will be watching this, and they would rather me just completely ignore things like this. But the fact is that tens of thousands of people have seen that video, and I think that a lot of them were deceived and fooled by the tactics and the rhetorical trickery that I'm going to point out in this video. So I hope that you will watch this in good faith. Let's get started. The main reason I have not talked about Vaush in this kind of concrete, confrontational manner, head on, is sincerely out of fear of retaliation from some of the very toxic elements of Vaush's audience, but also because I don't like talking about individual personalities that much. I try to avoid it because I think that the drama and the personal conflict gets in the way of discovering truth, especially with personalities like this, where there is just, a cultivated maelstrom of controversy. I don't usually make videos like this, and I know that this is going to be very controversial with my audience. A lot of people are going to tell me just not to engage. A lot of people are going to tell me that I should just ignore this. But I'm going to tell you why I am actually deciding to make this video. I think it's a huge problem. I think that the methodologies, if you want to call them that, the lens through which Vaush sees the world, the methodologies which Vaush applies to what could be considered his analysis, is counterproductive. I think it's harmful, and it really worries me that so many people are falling for what I see as sophistry. What is sophistry? It's basically a word that refers to rhetorical strategies which are deceptive and in which the main focus is on winning, dominating, and there's really no emphasis put on actually discovering truth. So it's basically just the strategy of doing what it takes to win in rhetoric. And I think that that's what Vaush does best. One of the most famous sophists of all time was Stephen Douglas, who famously debated Abraham Lincoln in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. If you've ever done debate in high school or whatever, you probably are familiar with that. And somebody wrote a description of Douglas, and they said, I think this is a really great description of Vaush, actually. He, Douglas / Vaush, was everywhere known as a debater of singular skill. His mind was fertile in resources. He was a master of logic. No man perceived more quickly than he the strength or the weakness of an argument, and no one excelled him in the use of sophistry and fallacy. Where he could not elucidate a point to his own advantage, he would fatally becloud it for his opponent. In that particular style of debate, which in its intensity resembles a physical contest, he had no equal. He spoke with extraordinary readiness. There was no halting in his phrase. He used good English, terse, vigorous, pointed. He was utterly destitute of humor and had slight appreciation of wit. Okay, that's not really Vaush's bag. Vaush has a little wit, I'll grant you that. He never cited historical precedents except from the domain of American politics. Aha. Inside that field, his knowledge was comprehensive, minute, critical. Beyond it, his learning was limited. Sound like someone familiar? He was not a reader. His recreations were not in literature. In the whole range of his voluminous speaking, it would be difficult to find either a line of poetry or a classical allusion. But he was by nature an orator, and by long practice a debater. He could lead a crowd almost irresistibly to his own conclusions. He could, if he wished, incite a mob to desperate deeds. He was, in short, an able, audacious, almost unconquerable opponent in public discussion. I don't think that sophistry is good for the left. I don't think that we just need to be trying to focus on winning debates on the internet, even with right-wingers. I think we need to be focused on discovering truth and aligning our ideology, right, our thoughts and our ideas with reality. To me, that is the main focus of political activity. This, to me, is one of the core reasons why dialectical materialism is such an important framework for my work. This stream that Vaush did, it's really remarkable. It's a remarkable document of the ways in which Vaush uses dishonesty, rhetorical trickery, and a lot of bullshit to kind of fool his viewers into thinking he knows shit when he doesn't. And believe me, I've seen enough of Vaush's stuff now that I know that this is not an isolated example. I also know that Vaush's more energetic fans love to talk about not showing context. I'm not going to obviously play the whole 2-hour video, but I will show the timestamp for every point we talk about, and I'm going to try to show, the beginning and middle and end of each point that I'm responding to. But if you feel like I've left context out, the time code is there, and you can go look it up for yourself. If you want to watch the whole stream of Vaush's, go ahead. Vaush does this stuff regularly. It's a pattern of behavior. I don't believe that Vaush is actually interested in seeking truth. I don't think that Vaush engages with people like Luna or the other people on the left that he has attacked to truly discover truth. He's there to win arguments in a performative manner to get clicks and views and money, which, and that's the other thing. Like, he's huge, okay? Being huge and having a huge audience doesn't mean you're right. Popularity is not criterion for correctness, right? If that were true, then Ben Shapiro and Steven Crowder would be much more correct than Vaush because they have much bigger audiences. So you can kind of tell when somebody is a sophist by looking at their worldview, right? Examining their worldview. Is it consistent? Is it coherent? Do they have clearly defined and established values? And do they have a clear, easy to identify perspective, right? Do they have a starting point where they see the world in a certain way? Do they have a philosophy that underlies everything that they say? You're looking for consistency and coherency in perspective. Sophists use eclecticism. Eclecticism is a hodgepodge philosophical framework in which you just grab points from wherever they're convenient to build your case. You can think of it as trying to build like a case from an a priori position, meaning you start with a conclusion and then you backtrack and look for evidence to support the conclusion that you made at the beginning. The video that we're going to watch and check out today, this stream, is nothing if not an a priori conclusion. Vaush goes into the video trying to guess and predict what Luna is going to say, already having the confidence that Luna is wrong, even though he's read none of the source material which Luna's ideas draw from. In that 2-hour stream, it's the first time he's ever watched the video live. He goes into it cold. He hasn't even done the basic investigation of watching it offline first and getting a basic idea of what she's going to say. In fact, he's guessing what she's going to say throughout the stream, and his guesses are all wrong. So it just shows that he has done no investigation before he speaks. I don't think that Vaush's worldview is coherent at all. Vaush is attacking concepts in Luna's video that he's unfamiliar with, and it's very obvious, and I will show you it. He's stretching and manipulating. So Luna's coming at this with a very concrete framework, the framework of dialectical materialism, which she understands very, very well. I also understand it very well. The reason I understand it very well is because I helped Luna over a year now. We've been researching, Luna's been translating, we've been editing, and I've been helping annotate a 300-page textbook, a translation of the Vietnamese curriculum on dialectical materialism. None of these ideas are our own. We don't come up with any of them from whole cloth. This is a text that was written by several dozen Vietnamese experts. These are people that have PhDs on Marxism-Leninism, on dialectical materialism. They actually do know the source material very well, and it's very well cited and sourced in the text. So there will be a few times where I'm going to go back to the words of Marx and Engels and show where Luna's ideas and information comes from, because it's not just something that she's making up off the top of her head. Okay, now you can disagree with this stuff, whatever, but Vaush is not interested in the big picture, coherent framework of dialectical materialism. Basically, Vaush's goal in watching Luna's video is to obfuscate, to distract from the points Luna's making, and I'll show you that again and again and again, and to derail the points that Luna very carefully constructs in, again, what is part one of a 3-part series, which isn't even really finished yet. So it's not like Luna is claiming to completely and exhaustively cover all points of dialectical materialism in, this part one of this 3-part series, or even in the whole 3-part series. It's a basic introduction to dialectical materialism. There are concepts that Vaush clearly does not understand. You might say that I'm poisoning the well. I'm telling you that these are patterns to look for. If you really think that I'm poisoning the well, then go watch the whole stream and then come back and watch this if you have that much time. But I'm just trying to build a case here that these are the things that we're going to be looking for again and again and again. Sophistry, incoherence, eclecticism. Another big thing you see with Vaush a lot is solipsism. In his book Ethics and Progress, the Marxist philosopher and ethicist Howard Selsom introduces this idea of moral solipsism. This is basically the worldview which begins in one's own mind, and it's the viewpoint that basically you could just sit around and discover truth by thinking about things in your own mind, and that your essentially opinions and logical conclusions that you craft idealistically in your own mind is a solid foundation from which to build a worldview. I think that Vaush, in his rhetoric, in his analysis, is a moral solipsist. He doesn't want to go to the texts. He doesn't want to go and look at the world. He wants to start in his own mind, sit around and think about stuff, come up with his idea of what's right, and then just blast it out and present it as though it's concrete fact. He's very confident in presenting things that he hasn't researched and hasn't experienced himself. When he talks about Vietnam, a country that Luna grew up in, he acts like he knows everything when he clearly has a very, very shallow understanding of this country and these people and of their lived experiences. And he's actually very disrespectful towards their lived experiences, as you'll see later in the video. And he's clearly not focusing on what Luna's saying. He's clearly half paying attention. He's looking at the chat as much, if not more, than he's looking at Luna. What I would expect to see in a respectful and thoughtful analysis, I would expect somebody to be paying attention, to go into it in good faith, just basically trying to understand what is actually being said. And then after checking all that stuff out, then drawing conclusions. There's this concept, which, the big, horrible, scary, tanky Mao came up with, but I don't care if you like Mao or not. The point is that it's a sound concept. I'm going to quote Mao now from his paper, Oppose Book Worship. He says, "You can't solve a problem? Well, get down and investigate the present facts and its past history. When you have investigated the problem thoroughly, you will know how to solve it. Conclusions invariably come after investigation and not before. Only a blockhead cudgels his brains on his own or together with a group to find a solution or evolve an idea without making any investigation. It must be stressed that this cannot possibly lead to any effective solution or any good idea. In other words, he is bound to arrive at a wrong solution and a wrong idea." Now, Mao's ideas here are grounded solidly in the fundamental principles of dialectical materialism that Luna presents in her video series. In fact, Vaush should probably have watched the rest of the series because Luna talks about seeking a comprehensive and historical perspective. That means exactly what we just read there. It means you go in and you investigate something very deeply before you draw conclusions and make judgments. Vaush doesn't do this here. He jumps in, he's got a preconceived notion in his head, he doesn't listen carefully, and he draws conclusions from his own reasoning, his own rhetorical trickery. We'll, again, watch that all unfold. It's just evident that he's demonstrating the exact flaws that Luna's discussing in her video series. And I think that if anybody would benefit from grounding themselves in solid dialectical materialist analytical methodology, it would be Vaush. Because Vaush doesn't seek a comprehensive perspective, doesn't like to read theory, says that, openly, is not familiar with the text that these things are based on, is not familiar with the history of Vietnam, which Luna references in this video in several examples, and yet presents himself as an expert to his audience. And unfortunately, because the audience doesn't know anything about dialectical materialism either, which isn't their fault, I didn't know anything about it until pretty recently in my life, because we're not taught this stuff, in the capitalist imperialist core of the USA and Europe and Canada, and the places where Vaush's audience is largely based. We're not taught this stuff. Luna was taught this stuff her whole life. into college. Now, you could say that she's brainwashed, whatever. I hope that you will at least check out what she's saying before you make those accusations. Again, I hope that you seek a comprehensive perspective before passing judgments like that. Because honestly, what she's learned through the curriculum of dialectical materialism is to examine as much evidence from as many sources as possible before making a judgment. It's as simple as that. And there are many other things that Vaush misunderstands about Luna's points on dialectical materialism, which I don't think comes from a lack of ability to understand Vaush's point. I don't think that Vaush has any kind of like mental or psychological or any other kind of barrier to understanding these points. They're actually very simple points. I think the problem is he's going into it already thinking he knows everything. And that is exactly what dialectical materialism seeks to prevent. And I think that it also presents a problem that Malatesta talked about. Malatesta talked about how we should not try to build and stoke up conflict with potential comrades in the working class as we try to build socialism. Malatesta was an anarchist, and he lived at a time when there was a lot of tension between anarchists and Marxist-Leninists and various other factions in the anti-capitalist, anti-fascist left. And he wrote, if we anarchists could achieve the revolution on our own, or if the socialists could on their own, we could enjoy the luxury of each acting independently and perhaps quarreling. But the revolution will be made by all the proletariat, all the people, whereas the socialists and anarchists are a numerical minority. That's even more true today than it was in Malatesta's time. Though they appear to enjoy the sympathy of the people as a whole, for us to be divided even when there are grounds for unity would mean dividing the workers, or rather cooling off their sympathies, as well as making them less likely to follow the socialistic line common to both socialists and anarchists, and which is at the heart of the revolution. It is up to the revolutionaries, especially the anarchists and socialists, to see to this by not exaggerating the differences and paying attention above all to the realities and objectives which can unite us and assist us to draw the greatest possible revolutionary advantage from the present situation. So in all honesty, I don't want to have beef with Vaush. I don't want to make this video. But I think that Vaush, by making videos called "This is the stupidest tanky video I've ever seen, brain damage suffered," about a Vietnamese woman who's just honestly, legitimately, I can tell you from spending every day of my life with her, trying to educate people about what she's learned and what she finds valuable as a socialist. And she's never said you have to do what she says. She's never once said you have to follow her ideas or follow what Vietnam has done. In fact, she says all the time, repeatedly, that you can't follow Vietnam's path because Vietnam has very unique history and material conditions, and your material conditions wherever you are in the world are going to be different. She's not trying to sway you or convince you. She's just giving information she's translating this work from the Vietnamese curriculum on dialectical materialism and presenting it to you and hoping that you'll find something valuable in it. And maybe it's not much. Maybe you don't like the ideas generally, but there's probably stuff in there that you'll find valuable if you'll just watch it and pay attention to it in good faith and check out the source material that it draws from, which is, again, fully cited in the book that she's translating.
All right. This is the video. I keep seeing screenshots of this on Twitter. It's called How to Think Like a Vietnamese Communist, an Intro to Dialectical Materialism. All right, I'm just going to lay all the cards up front, like right off the bat, okay? First of all, I've already read all theory. I don't want to hear it.
So Vaush says he's read all the theory. He doesn't want to hear it. And that's not true. I can tell you as somebody who has read all the theory that Luna cites, every word of it, because I helped make this video, and I've been helping her translate this book, and I have actually read the theory. He's not read the theory. There will be plenty of evidence for that. And let's just watch and see and find the evidence that Vaush has not actually read all the theory as he claims.
Second of all, and this is really important, okay? Marxism-Leninism isn't a real thing, okay? Basically, here's the history of leftist theory, all right? Cool dudes with revolutionary ideas wrote those ideas into paper and made them thoughts that people thought, okay? But then later, other people with different ideas took power of states, and they realized that the best way to maintain popular support was to maintain the veneer that their state craft was being guided by the ideology that was so popular with the people. So what they did was they created a fancy term called Marxism-Leninism, or, Marxism-Leninism-Maoism, or Marxism-Leninism with Ho Chi Minh thought, or whatever else. And essentially, they just took boilerplate authoritarian state ideology and were like, hey, but actually it's like the revolutionary state, so it's all good. I understand that you can get like a PhD in Marxism-Leninism in Vietnam, which is very funny to me that a capitalist state would allow you to get a degree in a subversive revolutionary ideology.
So Vaush has just glossed over decades of history of various nations, some that still exist and some that do not, without citing any sources. and just completely dismiss the concept of dialectical materialism by conflating it entirely with Marxism and Leninism, which dialectical materialism predates Lenin's work, okay, because Marx and Engels were developing dialectical materialism before Engels was born. Now, that being said, of course, it is true that Luna is learning things from a Marxist-Leninist framework in her college studies, which includes writings of Lenin, okay? So if you want to make specific claims about the Soviet Union or about Lenin, you can do that, but to just gloss over all of that history and present this very simplified and really dogmatic version of the events of history without citing any sources, without any evidence whatsoever, that's an example of sophistry. Now, I guess I can't expect him to give the entire history of the Soviet Union to prove his points or whatever, but I would expect some backing of his claims. And he never backs up his claims. He's not giving you a real comprehensive historical analysis whatsoever. He's just saying a bunch of stuff, conclusions that he's drawn in his own mind. And he's not even telling you what's led him to those conclusions.
To me, this is like hearing that like Amazon has like socialist, like side jobs you could do, or what are they called? Like the modules? Yeah, like socialism modules. You know what I mean?
All of this criticism that he's making of the curriculum that Luna translated, he's making it without having examined the curriculum at all. I know. How do I know this? Because currently the curriculum only exists in Vietnamese. Why do I know this? Because Luna's the first person to be translating it to English. Now, the videos that she's made are drawn from the same source material. And if he's watched all three of those, which he hasn't, he's only watched the first one on stream, but if he watched all three of those and he was actually drawing from what she is actually saying about the curriculum, it's one thing, but he's not. He's trying to connect two things together which are not connected. He's trying to build this rhetorical logic chain that falls apart upon any kind of scrutiny. He's saying, okay, first of all, these socialist states, they're actually capitalist states, so we can't trust anything that they say. Second of all, these curriculums that they make, they can't be subversive because they're not actually socialist states. But none of this is addressing what Luna actually says in her videos, which is literally just relating the essential ideas of Marx and Engels, dialectical materialism. He is, in fact, making a logical fallacy. And I always thought debate bros are supposed to be the experts on logical fallacies, but what he's doing is he's making an ad hominem attack. Now, the word ad hominem gets thrown around a lot, especially in the debatosphere, but it doesn't just mean that you're insulting your opponent. It means that you are saying that an opponent's arguments are invalidated because of who your opponent is. So in this situation, basically the entity that is the Vietnamese Department of Education, the Ministry of Education, is being invalidated. So it's like saying anything that comes from the Ministry of Education is invalid, period. It doesn't matter what they were drawing from, it doesn't matter what they say. That's an ad hominem attack. It is a logical fallacy. It's like if I was making this video and I just said, hey, Vaush is a jerk, he's a jackass, so everything he says is wrong. That's an ad hominem. It doesn't stand to scrutiny. Also, again, Vaush knows nothing at all about the Vietnamese Ministry of Education, doesn't know anything about the materials that they produce, has never seen the curriculum, hasn't even watched Luna's video, doesn't even know what she's going to say. So Vaush wants you to go ahead and dismiss all of these ideas from this curriculum, sight unseen, even though he's not seen them himself, simply because they come from a state which he doesn't think is legitimately socialist, as to say. This is horrifically incoherent. The reasons that we can attack a book or an essay or whatever are because of the things that they contain, the content. Okay, the background is important in studying the work because, again, you do want to seek a historical perspective, but Vaush doesn't know who wrote these books. He doesn't know the conditions under which they were written. He doesn't know the original sources from which they draw. And it's all evident in this little sophistic false logic chain that he presents and that his audience just, eats up because they don't know any better. So I'm going to show you now, some excerpts from this book that Luna's been tirelessly translating for over a year now. Look, it's all just referencing Engels. According to Engels, dialectics, so-called objective dialectics, prevail throughout nature, and so-called subjective dialectics, dialectical thought, is only the reflection of the motion through opposites, which asserts itself everywhere in nation, blah, 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 blah. And then down here, two more quotations, citations. Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, Friedrich Engels. The old preface to Anti-Düring on dialectics, Friedrich Engels. Have you really read all these books? Do you know what's being referenced here? So you're not just attacking the state. Look, the book is packed full of quotations from Engels and Marx. None of this stuff was just ginned up by the state. I'm telling you, because I wrote half these annotations or more. I did the research to fact check and back all this stuff up. None of the core ideas, none of the ideas that are being presented come from the state, okay? So regardless of whether or not you think that the state is legitimately socialist, this curriculum is rooted at the very foundation in direct quotes from Engels and Marx on dialectical materialism, the philosophy that Luna's presenting. Look, this is all quotations from Marx, from Engels, from Hegel even, from Lenin's notebooks, philosophical notebooks on Hegel. Have you read those? It's filled with citations. Anti-Düring, Dialectics of Nature. The core texts of dialectical materialism are being referenced here again and again and again and again. And this is the exact text that Luna's drawing from in her video. Okay, I'm not just making this shit up. Luna's not making this shit up. The Vietnamese Ministry of Education is not making this stuff up. They're drawing it directly from Marx and Engels, and yes, Lenin as well.
It's like, hey guys, listen, Bezos isn't so bad. Look, you can take a listen, okay? It's called the People's Warehouse. It's like, so yeah.
Show me, Vaush, where anywhere in Luna's video or anywhere in the text, they even talk about the state like this. They don't tell you anything positive in the entire 300-page book, which will be coming out soon. You can get a free copy for yourself. The digital version will be free. So you can go and check this hopefully within a month or two. They never talk about, even justify the state. They never even talk about that. The whole thing is about philosophy. So Vaush right now is talking about shit he does not understand at all. He has no basis to be saying the things that he's saying. He's acting like this is a textbook on why you should worship the state. It has nothing to do with that. It's about things like, the relationship between consciousness and the material world. It's about how things develop over time. It's about how all things in the universe are connected. He's painting a picture that is inaccurate. It's dishonest. And quite frankly, it's harmful to the left. He is, as Malatesta wrote, dividing the working class even where there are grounds for unity. And this is what he does throughout the video.
I never thought I would need any of this knowledge ever in my life. I thought I would just be a normal government office job for the rest of my life. But the world has gotten so scary so fast. Now I know that this knowledge is very important, and I'm glad I got to study Marxist-Leninist and Ho Chi Minh ideology so deeply as a student. So I'm going to share this knowledge with you now, but I will try to make it much less boring than my college classes were. I was born and raised as Marxist-Leninist. In Vietnam, we study Marxist-Leninism and Ho Chi Minh taught from primary school all the way through college.
That's so goddamn weird. What is that?
Why is it weird?
That definitely sounds like a economic and philosophical. It's not indoctrination. The weird thing is, okay, there's a very big difference, I think, between like being sort of implicitly taught something and being sort of like explicit state ideology.
You don't know what she was taught, Vaush. You don't know what she was taught. You've never seen a Vietnamese textbook. You don't speak Vietnamese, and this curriculum has never been translated into English until now. You don't know what she was taught. You don't know what you're talking about, but you're so confident. This is not how leftists should behave at all. This is not conducive to building a movement in which we trust each other and in which we are grounded in reality. You're making shit up. Debate bros are always accusing everyone of straw manning. That's exactly what you're doing. You're building a straw man of what Luna was taught. You don't know what she was taught. There's no way that you could know unless you speak Vietnamese. The book's not even out yet. The curriculum that she translated, which by the way, even the 300-page textbook is only the first part of one book from one of the classes that Luna took. You don't know what she was taught. You're making gross assumptions with absolutely no grounding in reality. That's what you're doing. I'm sorry, there's no other way to put this. And I know this is somebody who has actually been going through this book in, with a fine-tooth comb, checking every single fact, annotating it. Now, if you want to attack the ideas that Luna has, then actually talk about the ideas that she has, okay? What she's doing right now is she's explaining how she's come to possess this knowledge, okay? Which, yes, you could be skeptical of it, and that's fine. If all Vaush said at this point is, we should be skeptical because this is coming from a state that blah, 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 I don't trust, blah, 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 that's fine. But he's not. He's presenting as fact bullshit that he's just plucking out of his imagination. And that's what he's doing. There's no other way to put it. Again, Vaush is just making shit up and presenting it as fact, and it's very dishonest, disingenuous, and misleading. It's misinformation. He's actually doing what he accuses the USA of doing. He's indoctrinating his audience right now and not even disclosing that he's indoctrinating them, because he's presenting all this stuff like he knows what he's talking about and like he's gone and done all this research, and he doesn't know what he's talking about. He hasn't examined the curriculum. He's doing exactly what the USA curriculum of capitalist indoctrination does. Right? Just with unironic obliviousness and a complete lack of awareness of what he's actually doing and how he's doing exactly what he accuses the USA of doing. Now he's going to try to build the case that Vietnam is a capitalist country. So basically, nothing that you're going to see here has anything to do with the subject at hand. He's going to go to Google and quickly Google the GDP and do some hand waving about how the economy has gotten a lot better, which is supposed to be evidence for the fact that Vietnam is capitalist. And therefore, if Vietnam is capitalist, then nothing that comes out of Vietnam from Vietnamese socialists has any validity whatsoever. It's a way of discrediting Luna and silencing the Vietnamese socialist perspective. And again, it is a logically fallacious ad hominem attack. It's an attempt to poison the mind of the viewer into believing that anything that Luna will say in this video is immediately a priori invalidated, even though Vaush has never seen the video and has no idea what Luna is going to say and has no idea what sources are being drawn from. It's really outrageously ridiculous if you're paying attention. The problem is Vaush's audience is just nodding along and just scooping this stuff up without any critical thinking about the absolute disconnect between the GDP of Vietnam and philosophical points about dialectical materialism. Just watch.
Yeah, look at that. Right down here. I wish this was more like exponential or whatever, but like right here, back in 1988, I think, 1989, their GDP per capita was less than $100. It was 1/7 of the Philippines. Like, look at this. Nothing. And now it's like 30 times that, which is pretty incredible, right? GDP is a capitalist creation, and Vietnam is a capitalist country. I'm not sure what the issue is.
Oh, it's GDP is a capitalist creation, and Vietnam's a capitalist country. That doesn't mean anything. It's just another example of sophistry. He just throws that out there as a little dig at Vietnam to try to undermine Luna's points about dialectical materialism, which really have nothing to do with any of this. This is sound and fury signifying nothing. Okay, he's proving nothing with these charts, but let's just see what else he has to say. This is something that sophists do all the time, by the way. They make these little snide remarks because it rhetorically builds their case without adding any substance. And it also gives them plausible deniability that later on they can go back and say, oh, I was just joking, or you don't have a sense of humor or whatever. And this brings to mind also Socrates' critique of the sophists. He talked about there was a danger in teaching people rhetoric without teaching them wisdom. And, the fact that the sophists believe that there was no absolute truth and the truth is whatever you argue your way to defining. And Socrates talked about how the sophists would like blur the lines between humor and seriousness. So you never know if they're joking or not. So that if you ever do catch them in some kind of fallacy or, just making some kind of bullshit point, they could always just go, oh, I was just joking, have a sense of humor, bro. The sophists were doing that thousands of years ago. It's not a new trick. And Vaush is clearly doing that here now.
30 years is meaningful in any way, then yes, that does mean something. There is some kind of metric worth there, Criminologists in Vietnam basically just authoritarian stockdowns. If you want social democracy, go to the Scandinavian countries. Yeah, Vietnam has some good stuff, but yeah.
He just went and Googled a chart and looked at it for a few seconds. So there was absolutely no point in anything Vaush just said at all.
For over 100 years, Marxism has been tested all over the world. Many times, communism has almost been wiped out by capitalism. But to this day, Marxism still exists, and lately it's been growing more and more popular, even though capitalism has spent so much money and so many resources trying to wipe us out. For example, in the USA, capitalism is what gives the white supremacism and transphobia and all other forms of bigotry the power. It's the capitalist state that uses this, and lately it's been growing more and more popular, even though capitalism has spent so much money and so many resources trying to wipe us out. For example, in the USA, capitalism is what gives the white supremacism and transphobia and all other forms of bigotry the power. It's the capitalist state that
No, incorrect. Moving on. No, I will not elaborate. Any economic superstructure is going to be vulnerable to exploitation from bigoted groups, but that doesn't have to be capitalism. That could be feudalism. That could be mercantile.
When did she say otherwise, Vaush? When did she say otherwise? When did she say that capitalism is the only economic mode of production that can have secondary contradictions and other forms of oppression? Luna has written extensively in other works about secondary forms of contradiction and how Vietnam is still working to dismantle secondary forms of oppression as they're building socialism. She's written about these things. You are literally putting words in her mouth that she did not say, the definition of strawmanning. You're saying irrelevant bullshit right now. She didn't say that capitalism is the only form of economic production that leads to things like bigotry and prejudice and sexism. She said that under capitalism, it is the system of capitalism, which this is, by the way, basic Marxism, right? The economic base defines the superstructure. The superstructure also impacts the base. She's saying that under capitalism, it is capitalism which defines and enables these forms of oppression to exist as they do. A great example of that is whiteness. I have a whole video on how whiteness as a form of oppression dialectically developed alongside capitalism. Okay, so whiteness and racism against black people and people of color in the form which it takes in the bourgeois civil society, the superstructure which we have today, it exists in that form as determined by capitalism. That doesn't mean that it will just magically disappear when capitalism disappears, and capitalism won't magically disappear. And she never said that. And she didn't say that there aren't problems with, you know, different forms of oppression like sexism in Vietnam today. Luna faces sexism in Vietnam today. She's bisexual. She faces various forms of bigotry in Vietnam today. Okay, so she's not making the argument that a bourgeois civil society and capitalism are the only ways. You know she didn't say that. You just watched her talk for several minutes uninterrupted. Were you actually paying attention to what she was saying? Or do you just want to insert a little bullshit line of sophistic rhetoric that paints a picture of Luna inaccurately and leads your audience by the nose to believing that she believes things that she never stated, and in which, in fact, she has heavily contradicted in her body of work, which you have not examined?
There is no economic system that can insulate you from bigotry. They're two, not separate, but two distinct fights that have to be won.
Distinct, by the way, and if you study dialectical materialism, you'd understand this. And this is something that Luna taught me. Just as these forms of oppression are dialectically linked, in the sense that capitalism determines the ways in which oppression can function, right? Because under capitalism, the people with power are the capitalists, right? The bourgeoisie. And just as those forms of oppression reinforce each other, right? We know that racism and capitalism reinforce each other. Do you disagree with me? I know you have a bachelor's degree in sociology. Do you disagree with me? They reinforce each other, right? When you affect one thing, it affects the other thing. And when you fight racism, for example, you are also fighting capitalism because they reinforce each other. If you're doing it properly, and if you understand what you're doing, and that's all that Luna's really trying to say with her whole video series, is that these things aren't distinct. They're not static. They're not some kind of metaphysical construction of independent static ideas. They're not that distinct. They are intertwined. Under capitalism, they were under feudalism, and yes, they will be under socialism, which is why building communism and building a stateless classless society is going to be a long struggle. And yes, even as we build towards communism, we will still have to struggle with these other forms of oppression. She's never once said otherwise. Find me a place where she's ever said otherwise. You're making shit up, Vaush. And your audience doesn't see it because you're very gifted at making shit up with the utmost confidence, spewing it out as though it's well measured and based in the factual evidence or whatever. It's not. You just made a bunch of shit up. You put words in her mouth that she didn't say. Period.
If you want any, I mean, I'm an
and he just goes on and on. And you can go watch it. It's at 13:32 if you want to watch it.
ultra, I guess. So like I would say the USSR is social, or not social.
Maybe I can do a GoFundMe or something to try to translate them all. Follow me on Twitter or consider becoming my patron if you're interested.
I'd be down to see
I'll put the links
translations.
in the description.
I'm not trying to be mean, or yeah, I would be totally down to see. Yeah. I mean, obviously, like I'm coming in here with a pretty negative attitude towards this whole enterprise. But
Well, I'm glad that you just admitted that you're coming into this with a negative attitude and bad faith. The books are translated. We're doing the final edits now in the typesetting, and they'll be available soon, and the digital copy will be absolutely free. And if you want to donate to Luna Vaush, you know, for all the work that she's put into this over the last year, putting in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours in this translation, I've watched her doing it, then, you know, you can go check out her Patreon and support her there. You know, you've used her content enough to get, you know, super chats and shit on your platform. You know, it might be nice for you to throw a few bucks Luna's way. But anyway, moving on.
understand a ton of history. How there are a ton of historical developments, ideological shifts, wars, revolutions.
With dialectical materialism, that means you need to be able to dialectically argue about the world from a materialist perspective. Wow, that still sounds complicated, doesn't it? But you know, it's interesting. I think it's easy.
What's that meme right there? Monorail. Mono means one, and rail means rail.
You've obviously never been a teacher, Vaush, because that's how you introduce topics. If you say something like dialectical materialism to people who've never heard the term before, their eyes gloss over and they don't know what they're talking about. It's not absurd to explain how these words relate to each other and what they mean. Again, this is just sophistry. This is puffery. Okay, you're not actually saying anything. She's explaining it very carefully so that people like you won't go and misinterpret and misunderstand this shit. So why don't you try just actually paying attention to what she's actually saying? I know you think you're the smartest guy in the room, but she's actually making a point right now, especially people who aren't versed in dialectical materialism like you.
Does anyone have any questions? I don't want to nitpick the theory bit. I want to let her finish, and then I'll talk.
Easier to understand in Vietnamese. In Vietnamese, we call dialectical materialism 主nghĩa duy vật biện chứng. Biện chứng is dialectical, and it means arguing according to evidence. I think the Vietnamese version will help you understand the difference between Hegel's dialectical idealism and Marx's dialectical materialism, because Marx and Engels believe in using provable material evidence to argue dialectically. That's very important for...
No, it's not about material evidence. It's about material conditions. No.
What are you talking about?
No. Okay. Hegel and people more aligned with Hegel and Marx had different understandings of how progress was made in the world. You see, they were both modernist philosophers, which meant that they believed that the human experience, the philosophy of the world, the nature of things, could be concretely explained in singular narrative ideologies.
So once again, Vaush proves he has no idea what he's talking about. So this is, again, the book that Luna's been translating. Dialectics is a philosophical methodology which searches for truth by examining contradictions and relationships between things, objects, and ideas. This is what Hegel and Marx have in common. Marx and Engels studied Hegel's dialectics, his dialectical system, and they thought that it was very interesting that Hegel created a universal system of philosophy within a dialectical framework. They thought that was useful and valuable, but they were completely broke with Hegel over idealism. There's a reason that we call the philosophy of Marx and Engels dialectical materialism, and it's not because of the word material conditions. Yes, Marx and Engels talked about material conditions. Yes, material conditions are important for the development of socialism, and they determine things like human society, okay? And we'll talk about that more in just a second. But they broke with Hegel's stance of idealism. Hegel believed that truth was found through conscious activity. He was, in that sense, an idealist. Marx and Engels were materialists. Dialectics is this ancient classical philosophy that the Greeks used, this kind of framework for discovering truth. Hegel resurrected those ideas and formed them into this method of philosophical inquiry for German idealists. As Engels wrote in Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, Hegel's work's greatest merit was the taking up again of dialectics as the highest form of reasoning. The old Greek philosophers were all born natural dialecticians, and Aristotle, the most encyclopedic of them, had already analyzed the most essential forms of dialectical thought. Hegel's great contribution to dialectics was to develop dialectics from a simple method of examining truth based on discourse into an organized, systematic model of nature and history. Marx and Engels strongly rejected Hegel's idealism as well as the strong influences of Christian theology in Hegel's work, but they also saw great potential in the system of dialectics. As Marx explained in Capital Volume 1, the mystification which dialectics suffers in Hegel's hands, Hegel was a mysticist, an idealist, a theologist, a fideist. This mystification by no means prevents him from being the first to present its general form of working in a comprehensive and conscious manner. Comprehensive is very important here. It means that it's a universal system of analysis. That's what Marx and Engels liked about it. But they thought there were a lot of problems with the system. They thought the fundamental idea of creating a dialectical system of analysis that could be universally applied to all things, phenomena, ideas was good and cool, but they didn't like the idealism which permeated Hegel's works. That's why they conceived of materialist dialectics, dialectical materialism. As Marx wrote, with Hegel, it is standing on its head, which is to say it's idealist. It must be turned right side up again if you would discover the rational kernel within the mystical shell. So here's another piece of writing, Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, which Marx and Engels wrote. The final causes of all social changes and political revolutions are to be sought not in men's brains, right, not idealism, not in better insights into eternal truths and justice, but in changes in the modes of production and exchange. They are talking about the material basis of reality and the fact that we have to understand the material world and base our arguments and our ideas in the material world, unlike Hegel, who was an idealist. That is the whole point of calling it dialectical materialism, because it distinguishes their form of dialectics from Hegel. Vaush just smushed Hegel and Marx together and said that they were both modernists and they're like basically both in the same school of thought and that they both talked about material conditions. Hegel was not concerned that much with material conditions because he was an idealist. Hegel's whole point was that the first basis of truth is conscious activity. The first basis of truth is reasoning within the human mind. This is what Engels and Marx hated about Hegel. Did you know that? And if you knew that, then why did you just present things the way in which you just did? Were you being dishonest or are you ignorant? Because it's got to be one of those two things, because everything you just said is wrong.
Okay. So this is one of the reasons why postmodern neo-Marxist is kind of a funny term, right? You know, Marx was very much a modernist. In fact, I think Marx would
When did Luna ever say he wasn't a modernist? What's your point? Modernism, by the way, and Marx did develop modernism quite a lot. One of the foundations of modernism is looking for material evidence for things.
quite dislike postmodernism for a number of reasons. The idea behind dialectical materialism, reasons why postmodern neo-Marxist is kind of a funny term, right? You know, Marx was very much a modernist. In fact, I think Marx would quite dislike postmodernism for a number of reasons. The idea behind dialectical materialism is that the forces which move the world forward, which dictate history, human progress, are caused by the antagonisms which arise between different people's material conditions and class desires, or their what's that term? Their class interests. Thank you.
He's describing now historical materialism, which is rooted in dialectical materialism. So this is something where the waters are super muddied. Even Google, for some reason, says that dialectical materialism and historical materialism are interchangeable concepts, but they're not. Historical materialism is the application of dialectical materialism to history. And what's remarkable about that is that Marx and Engels were basically trying to develop a scientific way of looking at history. And they saw class struggle rooted in material conditions as the driving force of history. Because, as dialectical materialism dictates, the material determines the ideal. In that sense, the economic base, the structure, determines the superstructure. Things like our political forms, our culture, our art, religion, et cetera, but those things also impact back on the material. That's the key point of dialectical materialism, is that the material determines the ideal, but the ideal also impacts the material. That's what breaks them from the pure empiricists and the positivists. And we'll talk about that more a little bit later. And that's what Luna's really talking about in this video, is the difference between Marxist dialectical materialism and mechanistic empiricist positivism, where, you know, the positivists and the empiricists believe that the material defines everything and that the ideal determines nothing, and that the only truth that can be sought is through what we observe with our senses. Marx actually saw that as a weakness of empiricism, because he believed that what happens in consciousness does matter because it can impact the material world, essentially, is what Marx was saying. And if you read Dialectics of Nature or Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, or Anti-Düring, you'll see that Marx and Engels, or Capital, Marx and Engels talked about this stuff all the time, extensively. They didn't just talk about historical materialism. Dialectical materialism was used in the analysis of capitalism in Das Kapital, which did draw from historical materialism, but historical materialism is a specific application of dialectical materialism to history. But Vaush here is talking about historical materialism as if that is what dialectical materialism is. It's not. Historical materialism is a specific kind of focused field of dialectical materialist philosophy to history. I don't know how else to say it. If he doesn't know that, it's because he hasn't studied this stuff deeply enough to know the difference between dialectical materialism and historical materialism, which is based on dialectical materialism. It's as simple as that.
There's a critical, the idea here essentially is a rejection of the old idealists, you know, who believe that the human condition, the human spirit, human society, whatever, advance through a kind of ideological debate where you have concepts which are refined through antagonisms that arise in the conflict between different variants of an idea, right? But what Marx said was, actually, that's gay and stupid and dumb and bullshit, okay? In reality, ideas aren't what drive things forward. In reality, it's material conditions. People, societies even, aren't really motivated by ideas.
Let me make this very simple for you, Vaush. You're describing historical materialism, which is a specific application of dialectical materialism. So it's confusing you when Luna talks about the much more broad and universal aspects of dialectical materialism, which you're not familiar with. So what Luna is saying here does not contradict what you're saying at all about historical materialism. In fact, what Luna is describing is what historical materialism, which you're describing, is rooted in. Luna is describing the foundation of the ideas that you're bringing up. And the fact that you can't distinguish between historical materialism and dialectical materialism leads me to think you shouldn't be so goddamn smug about all of this.
Let's take America, for example. America was founded, nation, free for all, whatever, but there were slaves and women couldn't vote. Also, white people couldn't vote if they weren't property owners, or women, whatever, you know, nobody could vote, basically. Okay. So, now, some people argue, you know, well, ideologically, we arrived at a dialectical resolution when we passed the Civil Rights Act, when we allowed women to vote, et cetera, because these conflicting ideas, they challenge one another, so on.
See, he thinks that dialectics just means things conflicting with each other, but it doesn't. A dialectical relationship is simply a relationship in when two things influence each other. They can be mutually productive, actually. So for instance, the LGBTQ plus movement and anti-racism can dialectically influence each other in productive ways that benefit both. Conflict is what tends to drive development, and there are a lot of reasons for that, which Luna goes into in her book. But essentially, there are many forms of dialectical relationship, and dialectical development can take many forms. And to simply say that people argue with each other, that's what dialectics are, or to say that different movements butting heads with each other, that's what dialectics are. That's just inaccurate. Dialectical development, it's rooted in motion, which is what Marx and Engels called just change, okay? As things move and change, it leads to changes in quantity, which leads to eventually changes in quality, and that is what dialectical development is. And the motion happens, the change occurs as things impact each other, and that is what dialectical development is. And yes, all things develop dialectically, including the history of the bourgeois state of the United States of America, including the development of capitalism from feudalism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But Vaush just gave a really weird and inaccurate definition of dialectical development that's not rooted in Marx or Engels at all. So here's Engels describing in perfect detail what dialectical development is. And this is from Luna's curriculum translation on dialectical materialism. We find upon closer investigation that the two poles of an antithesis, positive and negative, are as inseparable as they are opposed, and that despite all their opposition, they mutually interpenetrate, are mixed together. And we find, in like manner, that cause and effect are conceptions which only hold good in their application to individual cases. But as soon as we consider the individual cases in their general connection with the universe as a whole, they run into each other, and they become confounded when we contemplate that universal action and reaction, in which cause and effects are eternally changing places, so that what is effect here and now will be cause here and then, and vice versa. So Engels is explaining, I'll just read the annotation, that since all things, phenomena, and ideas are relationally linked and interrelated, the mutual impacts and processes of development which lead to change, the reasons and results which transpire between all things, phenomena, and ideas, are all linked and interrelated. In addition, what we see as the result is also the reason for some future result. This is called the law of unity and contradiction, and it's a key core foundational element of dialectical materialism. It means that things in the framework of Marx and Engels are defined by the relationships that they have internally and externally. As a human being, you're defined by the relationships between your consciousness and your body. You're defined by the relationship between your cells. You're defined by the relationship between all your different organs. You're defined by your external relationships with the foods that you eat, which, that goes from an external relationship into an internal relationship through the digestive process. You are defined by your relationships with your fellow human beings. You are defined by your relationships with the means of production. And yes, you are defined by your relationship with material conditions. That is the core, fundamental attribute of dialectical materialism. It's not just things arguing and butting up against each other. That's part of it, but that's not what defines dialectical materialism. Marx and Engels saw the world as one complex system, a process in motion. Marx did not divide things up statically into different struggles. You have your struggle against racism, your struggle against sexism, whatever. He saw everything, all things, phenomena, and ideas in all of the universe as intrinsically intertwined and mutually impacting each other. And he tried to look at things in terms of their internal and external relations. That's how he defined capital, the capitalist mode of production so brilliantly in the book Capital. He defined capital and the capitalist mode of production as this complex system of processes in motion defined by relationships. So that is what dialectical materialism is. It's not what you just said.
Some people argue, well, ideologically, we arrived at a dialectical resolution when we passed the Civil Rights Act, when we allowed women to vote, et cetera, because these conflicting ideas, they challenge one another, so on. But if you look at things, I disagree strongly. If you take a look, for example, at the abolition of slavery, one of the big things there is the core question: why was the South so inured with slavery when the North wasn't? And to me, the answer is economics. Okay, it's not because the North was more ideologically developed; it's because the South was less economically developed. They still relied on plantations and cotton picking. So to them, they had to come up with ideological justifications for the material state of things. You understand?
Okay, let me try to follow this. Vaush is saying that some people say that dialectical development is rooted in arguing between ideas. which is not what Luna said. In fact, it's been a long time since Luna said anything, so let's go back real quick and look at the last thing Luna said.
So they took the ideas of Hegel and Feuerbach and developed them to create their system of understanding the world, which we call dialectical materialism. So in order to understand Marxism and Leninism, you have to learn how to examine the world with dialectical materialism. That means you need to be able to dialectically argue about the world from a materialist perspective.
Luna said you need to be able to understand the world from a materialist perspective, right? Argue about the world from a materialist perspective. That does not contradict historical materialism. That does not contradict anything that Vaush just said about material conditions being prerequisites for ideology, or being the driving force of ideology. It doesn't contradict it at all. Okay, Luna never said that dialectical development is about ideas competing with each other. That's basically idealist dialectics, which Hegel developed. And then you're saying you disagree with idealist dialectics, and you believe that it's, development is rooted in material conditions. In other words, that material conditions determine development of societies, which is what Marx said in historical materialism, which is rooted in dialectical materialism, which is what Luna's video is about. And Luna hasn't said anything that has contradicted anything that you're saying. And I'm losing my mind, because this is just a huge dog and pony show where you're now inventing and fabricating opponents that you're now debating with, and you've just completely gone off the rails and completely forgotten what Luna was talking about. But you're pretending that this is all, towards the ends of destroying Luna, when nothing that you're talking about has anything to do with anything that you've heard Luna say so far. Somebody please help me understand how anyone falls for this shit. Just to bring it back to what Luna was actually saying and what Vaush is misinterpreting, that means we need to be able to build our ideology, which does mean developing arguments and developing a perspective rooted in material reality, because it means that we will be ineffective as people who are trying to impact the material world. In other words, trying to change the world through revolution. We will be ineffective if we just come up with ideas with no basis in what's actually happening in reality and what's disconnected from the ways in which material processes actually function. One of the key points that Marx and Engels made, and one of the things that they lived throughout their entire lives as revolutionists, is that you can only impact the world and affect it if you understand the world functionally from a materialist perspective, and if you understand the ways in which the conscious human activity and labor processes, which is the application of consciousness through your human body into the physical world. That is the only way in which you can affect change. First of all, Vaush is kind of bastardizing the idea of historical materialism by couching it in these kind of mechanistic terms. It's not just that the material conditions only determine human society. That's positivism, that's empiricism, which Marx and Engels also broke from. Marx and Engels also recognized that we could consciously impact the material world, and that's crucial, because that's how we can accelerate the fall of capitalism and build a socialist society without capitalism coming back and taking power again. That's the only way to advance human society, is to understand how material conditions influence the conscious world of human culture and civilization and society, and to understand how our human consciousness and our conscious activities can drive and impact material process. That's really key. That's what Luna's describing here. And you don't understand that because you don't understand the differences between dialectical materialism and historical materialism, nor do you really truly understand what Marx and Engels were saying as they built up this philosophical system of dialectical materialism, which is what historical materialism was rooted in.
Understanding dialectical materialist thinking. For now, just remember, dialectical materialism is all about understanding the world by forming arguments which are based on evidence which we get from the real world.
No, just no. I reject. I could be very wrong on this, but no. This is the ideological perspective. It's not about the arguments. It's not. It's just that, as opposed to what, the non-evidentiary arguments. Yeah, this is empiricism. This is a philosophy concept.
This really upsets me because he doesn't understand the relationship between Hegel and Marx and Engels. And he doesn't understand how important it was to Marx that they broke with Hegel's idealism. You have got to understand the historical development which led to Marx and Engels discovering these truths about the world. Marx and Engels were not empiricists, and they were not idealists. They had another position, which we call dialectical materialism. They were Germans that were living in the shadow of Hegel. Hegel was monumentally influential in Germany with the German idealists. Marx and Engels were young Hegelians. The young Hegelians were idealists who were heavily influenced by Hegel's idealist philosophy. So yes, in the context in which Marx and Engels were developing dialectical materialism, they were absolutely arguing against idealists who believed that reason and logic within the human mind and consciousness alone was the foundational basis of truth. They were saying that's bullshit. We have to base things on evidence. But they also broke from the empiricists, actually. And that's something else that Vaush doesn't understand. When Luna says that we have to create arguments which are based on evidence which we get from the real world, you also have to realize that this is just the beginning of a 3-part series. Let me show you something that Vaush did not watch, which is part 2 of Luna's 3-part so far series, where she talks specifically about the differences between empiricism and dialectical materialism.
In Marx's day, many economists were empiricists, meaning they believed that the only source of human knowledge is sensory experience. Empiricists completely rejected all the things that happen to data inside human brain. This was an earlier form of materialism, and Marx was strongly opposed to empiricism because he felt like it opened the door to idealists who rightfully said that the way the mind processes information about the world is important to understanding ourselves and our societies. Marx knew that what happened inside the mind mattered, and this is what led him to examine the dialectical category of content and form.
So yes, Marx and Engels were not the same as empiricists. Okay, and if you watch the rest of her series, you would see her say that clearly. And they were absolutely arguing against idealism because that was the big, trendy meme of the day, which the philosophers that were the contemporaries of Marx and Engels were enamored with. Feuerbach was actually the first to break from that idealism in a sort of form of primitive materialism that Marx and Engels drew from, but that's beyond the scope of this. The point of the matter is that, yes, they were absolutely arguing against non-evidence-based methods of inquiry. That's why they called it dialectical materialism, to distinguish it from the idealistic dialectics of Hegel and the young Hegelians. Now, to prove that Luna's not just making this shit up, let's again reference the works of Marx and Engels when they talked about positivism and empiricism and the problems that they had with that. The translation of the book that Luna's working on talks about empirical consciousness a lot and recognizes the importance of empirical data and empirical consciousness. So drawing from empirical material evidence was very important to Marx and Engels in developing dialectical materialism. They thought that everything that we believe about the world should be rooted in material evidence. But they were not empiricists. Empiricism was developed strongly by Hume, who was a major skeptic because he believed that the only way to find truth was through sense data, right? So therefore he believed that we couldn't really be absolutely sure about anything because our consciousness is unreliable. And so he actually thought that humans were incapable of perceiving truth. Marx and Engels strongly disagreed with this form of empiricism, and they didn't believe that the material world was the only driving force of reality. They believed that consciousness and labor activity and conscious activity could impact the material world. So that's how they broke from the empiricists, as they also broke from the idealists. So reading from Luna's translation here, Marx and Engels also consider themselves to be materialists. However, they believed that this strict empiricist view made materialism vulnerable to attack from idealists because it ignored rational knowledge that went beyond sense data. In particular, hardline empiricism ignores social relations, which can't be analyzed through sense data and sense observation alone. So for example, just take a look at capitalism. You can't touch or feel capitalism, right? You can touch and feel the effects of capitalism. You can look at racism. You can't touch or feel ideas like racism. You can definitely see the effects of racism, but racism is an idea. It's a conscious thought pattern, okay? It's a social relation. And you can't analyze these social relations through sense data. That's how they broke from the empiricists and the positivists. So as Marx wrote in Capital Volume 1, the true reality of the value of commodities contrasts with the gross material reality of these same commodities, the reality of which is perceived by our bodily senses, and that not an atom of matter enters into the reality of value. We may twist and turn a commodity this way and that as a thing of value, it still remains unappreciable by our bodily senses. It's clear that Marx and Engels thought that there was more to understanding reality than just sense data and empirical data. Empirical data is very important, but it's not the only thing that's important. And that's what was really groundbreaking about Marx and Engels, is that they were basically synthesizing materialism with the fact that conscious activity also affects the world. That was the big breakthrough of Marx and Engels. That's what put them ahead of Hume and Feuerbach and Hegel and all of their predecessors and all the people that they were drawing from, they synthesized these ideas into the school of dialectical materialism, which is not the same as empiricism, even though it draws from empirical data. You have to understand that distinction. And it certainly counters the arguments of idealism that were so strongly put forth by Hegel. And you don't understand that because you haven't read any of this stuff. Now, watch the way that Vaush just jumps on like a rhetorical predator onto what he perceives as a teeny tiny little weakness in the semantics of how Luna is about to word a sentence.
No class is more important or powerful than any other class, and no race is.
There's no class. Wait, if there's no class, then there is no class is any more powerful than any other class.
This is one of the most asinine and ridiculous, sophistic non-points in the entire 2-hour stream. That's her point, Vaush. By definition, when there's no economic class that dominates any other economic class and everyone's equal, right? There's no class. What do you really think she's saying? What do you think she's saying? This is so ridiculous. This is sophistry. Everything she makes perfect sense. Everything she said makes perfect sense. You're trying to build, under socialism, the goal is to build a society in which everyone is equal, in which no class dominates any other class, and therefore there is no class. That makes perfect sense. Maybe you don't like the way she phrased it, but come on. You have to know what she meant. This is just such a non-point.
This is, what are you talking about? What you can't, this is literally, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others.
No, it's not. You are so full of shit. This is exactly the kind of sophistry that was described in that description of Stephen Douglas. You're very skilled at looking for any weakness in a specific individual statement and then laser focusing in on that and picking that apart. In this case, literally just the semantics of a sentence that she put together without trying to understand what's actually being said or the broader points that are being made. This is sophistry. It is rhetorical trickery. It makes Vaush look so smart, like he really knows what he's talking about, and he's so much smarter than Luna. But really, he's making this really bullshit point that's really a reaction to nothing at all that Luna was saying. That's what I really want people who watch this to understand. You have to be aware of the ways in which these rhetorical tricks are used by people on the internet to mislead you and to make you think that people like Luna are saying things which they're not. He's acting like Luna just said the most ridiculous thing that anyone's ever uttered in their life, when all she's saying is that, yes, by definition, communism, a stateless, classless society, is a situation in which there's not one class that dominates other classes. In that sense, there is one economic class. That's the goal of communism.
What are you talking about? A classless society where none of the classes have more powerful than the other ones. What are you talking about?
This is just such a, and he goes, he's just going on about it. It's just a non-point. Pure sophistry, puffery.
As a retired warrior, all right? I meet my comrades in battle, all right, regardless of their origins, okay? As a retired Ronin, all right?
Now, I want to point out that Vaush uses the R slur several times during this stream, which I just find detestable. As a disabled person, as somebody who's well aware of the multiple forms of genocide that disabled people are facing right now, that's really just kind of an aside. I find it despicable, but whatever. That's really just an aside that I have to make, okay? Because I just think it's disgusting. So I just have to throw that out there.
According to Lennon, matter is a philosophical category denoting objective reality, which is given to man in his sensations, and which is copied, photographed, and reflected by our sensations, while existing independently of them. Under this philosophical viewpoint, the most common attribute of all forms of matter is objective existence. It means
Chat, I'm not a philosopher. Isn't she literally just talking about empiricism right now?
No, she's not talking about empiricism, Vaush. You're not a philosopher because you haven't read any of the basic, most fundamental texts of Marx and Engels, which she's referencing. They were anti-empiricists. They were anti-positivists. I've explained all of this. You literally don't know what you're talking about, and now you've got your chat thinking that she's saying something that she's not saying. What Marx believed is that there is an objective existence. There is a world outside of us. And they believe that we can obtain empirical data about the world through our senses. But again, breaking with the empiricists like Hume and many, many others, they believed that we also have the ability to consciously affect the world. And they believe that conscious activity matters and needs to be taken into account in their philosophical system. The system which they call dialectical materialism, which just simply says that the material determines the conscious activity while conscious activity impacts the material world. That's the big difference between Marx and Engels and the empiricists. That's what she's explaining right here, very, very in simple terms, which you should be able to understand if you would just pay attention and listen to what she's actually saying in good faith. She's explaining, and we'll go on in part 2 to explain even more, how we as human beings are able to sense the objective world that exists outside of us. Many of the idealists either believe that there was no empirical world outside of us and that consciousness kind of defined reality, but more of them, like Hegel, believes that there was an objective existence outside of us, but it wasn't the ultimate source of truth, and that the ultimate source of truth was conscious reasoning. That's what Hegel believed. That's why all this stuff is important. In the context of when and why Marx and Engels were developing these ideas, they were the first to create a universal framework of philosophy that synthesized the idea that we have an external empirical world which we can obtain information about through our senses, with the fact that conscious activity can also go back and impact the world. That's what this is. She's not describing empiricism. She's describing the process of collecting empirical data about the objective world. Empiricism is a very specific philosophy that says that the only source of truth is empirical sense data. And that's not what Marx and Engels believed. And you would know that if you read Dialectics of Nature, Anti-Düring, Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, or anything in Capital, because Marx talks about this all the time in Capital as well.
Now, or physicalism, the idea of you know, the distinction between, you know, experience and reality.
No, it's not a distinction between experience and reality. It's the synthesis of our human conscious activity and the objective external world. You're literally just making shit up again. You're putting words in Luna's mouth that she didn't say. She's very clearly explaining what she means, and you're not listening. You're taking your limited understanding of philosophy and shoving it down her throat. It either means, if you actually know what you're talking about, that you're a deceitful, misinformation spreading liar who's trying to twist this, or what I think is more likely, you don't know what you're talking about, and you're finding little chunks of things that you have some basic awareness of and glomming onto them to try to build up this sense that you know more than you do. Because you're talking about irrelevant things to try to lead the audience by the nose into thinking that Luna's saying things that she's patently and clearly not saying. So if you would pay more attention to the objective reality of what Luna's actually saying and process that through your consciousness in good faith, you would see that she's not describing physicalism or empiricism. She's describing the relationship between human consciousness and empirical objective reality, which Marx and Engels described in Dialectical Materialism. So now Vaush is just going to start guessing what Luna's going to say, and he gets it totally wrong. So let's hear what Vaush's guess is first.
He's going to say that materialist philosophies are tied to an understanding of the world adjacent to the scientific methods process for arriving at understandings of the world. So by connecting empiricism and materialism, she is mistakenly claiming that a philosophical construct like Marxism is as empirically derived from natural evidence as, say, for example, the speed of light is from observation. Problem here is that I feel like all of this the reason she's going on this whole unnecessary tangent is because it sets up some bad philosophy. I mean, I could be totally wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's what she's going to say.
Spoiler alert, Vaush is totally wrong.
Then sends the images, the information into your brain, and based on those images and information, your brain builds consciousness about the world. The reflection of the world varies in each person's mind. For example, for people who were born blind or deaf, their consciousness about the world is very different from people who don't have the same conditions. Blind people can't see, so their world has no color. Deaf people can't hear, so their world doesn't have sound. So it means even though we share one same material world, each of us have a different consciousness about the world. So what creates
just so you know, Vaush, you were completely fucking wrong, but you've already got your chat believing that she's going to be talking about that she's conflating Marxism and dialectical materialism with empiricism and physicalism, and she's you've already planted that seed in their head. So now that's what they're going to come away from this thinking, is that she said something that she didn't. Classic example of sophistry and rhetorical trickery. She actually said something that you could not possibly fucking argue with. How are you going to counter that? You're going to wait for Luna to say something, some sentence, some little snippet that you can go and start rhetorically attacking. You can actually see the look on Vaush's face as he's listening carefully, waiting for something to change the subject, because what he was building up earlier was full of shit, and now he knows that. So now he's trying to find something else to kind of like zigzag to. This is sophistry. This is rhetorical trickery. So watch what he does.
Consciousness emerges from social activities, specifically language and labor. Basically, Marx believed that we develop consciousness from interacting with each other and from interacting with our...
No.
So notice that he's not going to go back and address that he was wrong earlier and that everything he said was bullshit and she didn't say what he predicted or guessed she was going to say. He doesn't address that at all, because what he did was he found a little what he sees as a weak point that he can attack rhetorically. So let's see what he says now, completely ignoring all the bullshit he said earlier that, she blew out of the water with what she actually said. Instead, he finds this point to rhetorically attack.
No, hold on. The development of consciousness, like class consciousness, relates to your experiences regarding yourself and...
Oh, You have no fucking clue at all what she's talking about or what you're talking about. She's not talking about class consciousness. What? Where did you pull that from?
Consciousness emerges from social activities, specifically language and labor. Basically, must believe that we develop consciousness from interacting with each other and from interacting with our...
No. No, 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 no.
She's actually talking about just consciousness, like human thought. She's not talking about class consciousness. This is the weirdest deflection I've ever seen. Let's listen. Let's continue listening.
The world around you. That's not the same as internal sentience, which is what she was referring to beforehand.
So why are you talking about class consciousness?
The consciousness that she was referring to beforehand was the purported distinction between empirical reality and experiential consciousness. But that's not the same thing as consciousness in the relation between yourself and the world around you. Those are different things.
What are you talking about? Why did you bring up class consciousness? First of all, she's not talking about class consciousness. Second of all, she's talking about consciousness as the internal processes of the human mind. The ideas that we have, the thoughts that we have, those processes, and the relationships between ideas within the human mind. That's what she's talking about. Your consciousness has a relationship with the physical world, which is what she's trying to explain. But you're not listening. You're going off about some bullshit about class consciousness?
When a person says you are class conscious, they don't mean you experience internal qualia distinct from the material world around.
I don't know why you're saying, who are you talking to right now? No, look at the chat. Is she using class consciousness like JBP? She's not talking about class consciousness. Vaush just injected that thought into this discussion where it doesn't belong. At no point has Luna talked about class consciousness. She's literally just talking about consciousness. You just did this very weird straw man, and your chat is buying it up hook, line, and sinker. Look, holy fuck, she was trying to discuss class consciousness? No, she wasn't. Not at all. This is such a dirty, sneaky little trick, and it only works if your audience, by the way, is just eating up everything you're saying without processing it critically at all. It's like really actually embarrassing for these audience members that they're falling for this. It's complete horseshit what he's doing here. And it's deceptive, and it's misleading, and it's dishonest. Or he just has absolutely no fucking idea what he's talking about. One or the other. It's got to be one or the other.
She hasn't said class consciousness yet.
She's not talking about class consciousness. Why do you think she's talking about class consciousness? She's talking about dialectical materialism as a philosophical foundation of the work of Marx and Engels. And this has ripple effects throughout all of the work that they did, the relationship between class and consciousness. I read the excerpt earlier in which, in Capital, in which he talks about how social relations are really important for understanding capitalism. Social relations are rooted in consciousness. You can't observe them with sense data. You just started talking about class consciousness. You pulled that completely out of your ass. And now you're acting like she's some kind of ding-dong for talking about something that she's not even talking about. It's disgusting what you're doing, Vaush. And I don't know if you're conscious of it or you're just so ignorant that you can't follow this very simple, discussion that Luna is leading here. But either way, it does not speak very well for your ability to analyze and interpret and relate ideas to your audience, who just also seem to scoop up whatever bullshit you distribute to them. It's embarrassing. Vaush, she is mixing up different words with different definitions in different contexts to create an exquisite word salad. No, she's not. She's explaining the relationship between consciousness and reality as Marx defined it. Let's go look at the transcript of the video. Class consciousness, 0 results. Consciousness, 27 results. She's not talking about class consciousness. You fucking injected that into this discussion very dishonestly and got your chat thinking she was saying something she wasn't saying. This is such dirty and very transparent sophistry that anybody who's actually following along and really trying to engage with in good faith would see. It's so obvious what's happening here. So, he goes on and on for several minutes, and now I'm going to skip ahead to what I think is the most unnerving example of Vaush clearly not paying attention to what's being said. And this is what I'm probably going to end on here with the viewing.
I also don't agree with people who believe Stalin did nothing wrong, because it's so obvious that he did many things wrong, including treating Ho Chi Minh badly. He thought Ho Chi Minh was a spy from a capitalist country and didn't believe Vietnam could win against France. And Stalin refused to support Vietnam, which obviously pisses me off. But that doesn't mean I want to...
But the only fucking thing she has on Stalin is that...
See, that's not the only things that she has on Stalin. It's one example she used. This is another example of just looking for one little rhetorical opening. This is phenomenon which he's attacking, not the essence of what she's saying. She gave one example, and then you're twisting it to make it sound like she only has one example. And I know you're laughing, so you can go back and say it was just a joke, because that's another tactic of sophistry. But that's what you're doing. You're basically programming this into your audience's head. You're convincing your audience that this is the case, but then you're also giving yourself some plausible deniability with your little laughing. But that's not the grossest part. That's coming up.
Stalin didn't do enough for the country she's been brainwashed by. Oh my God.
Waste all my time arguing about whether Stalin was essentially good or essentially bad. But a waste of time. Speaking of Ho Chi Minh, the great leader of Vietnam, he also made mistakes. In my opinion, his most serious mistake was the land reforms in the 50s. My family members were victims, so I do know about that very well. In the early 90s,
Luna's talking now about her family. She said, my family members were victims. That's how she sets this up. So if Vaush is actually listening and paying attention to what she's saying, then in my mind, there's really no excuse for the reaction he's about to have. And a lot of people have tried to excuse this, but I find it inexcusable. What we have here is Luna, who is a human being, talking about her very deep personal experiences with her family, her grandfather, who, by the way, was a complicated man. Okay, Luna will tell the story, but there are parts that she leaves out, so I'll add those as we continue.
In the 50s, the North of Vietnam wanted to build a communist society while we were fighting against France. Ho Chi Minh wanted to redistribute the farmland so everyone would have their own farm, their own means of production. My family was super rich back then.
Okay, she said my family's super rich back then. So here's the story. More of the story than she tells in this video. Luna's grandfather was a rich landlord, but through the fascist occupation from that point of Japan, when Japan occupied Vietnam, from that point on, Luna's grandparents both starved. Luna's grandmother had health problems for the rest of her life from the starvation that she suffered through under the occupation of the Japanese fascists in Vietnam. During the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, Luna's grandfather, who at that time really was still a landowner and still exploitative, but also had gone through starvation, was suffering in his own right. You know, I'm just telling you what happened, right? I'm not making any judgments one way or the other. But he took a bicycle loaded with rice and walked it from Thanh Hoa to Dien Bien Phu. You know, it was a weeks-long journey, and he participated in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in that way. And what she's talking about here, I think, is really germane and relevant to why I'm bringing this up. She's talking about the differences between essence and phenomenon. What Vaush is doing is he's looking for little phenomena that he can go and pick apart while ignoring the essence of what's being discussed. So Luna says, my family were victims of these reprisals, of this, you know, you'll hear the rest of the story. But Vaush is not trying to understand the essence of the full story of what she's saying. He's locked in trying to find things to pick apart. He's looking for little phenomena to rhetorically attack because he can't attack the whole, because he doesn't understand the whole. So let's keep going.
We were landlords for maybe 100 years, and we owned shitload of land. The communists in my grandparents' village implemented that order in a horrible way. They took everything from my grandparents, even the shirt on my grandma's body. They tortured my grandpa for days in the big yard of the village.
People are saying, oh, he wasn't laughing at your grandparents' torture. Look at the faces he's making in the smirk as Luna describes the ways in which her family was tortured. And remember, she opened this whole discussion by saying my family were victims. Anyone who's trying to listen in good faith would be like, okay, they're victims. How are they victims? Let's hear this story. But he's just going into it in like the most shitty bad faith take because everything's a joke to him. He is not taking this seriously at all. And look at the faces he pulls.
Means of production. My family was super rich back then. We were landlords for maybe 100 years, and we owned shitload of land. The communists in my grandparents' village implemented that order in a horrible way. They took everything from my grandparents, even the shirt on my grandma's body. They tortured my grandpa for days in the big yard of the village. All the peasants who worked for my grandparents took the chance to get revenge too. It was a very traumatizing memory for both of my grandparents. So in 1956, Ho Chi Minh realized what he did wrong, and immediately fixed it.
What she's saying is Ho Chi Minh did not order this to happen. The people, the peasants on the ground in her village took the opportunity to torture her grandfather and take revenge. And then as soon as Ho Chi Minh heard about it, he put a stop to it. That's what she's saying. This is how Vaush reacts to this story.
In our National Assembly in the same year, he cried and apologized to the whole nation. My family understood that his original order was not that brutal.
His original order was not that brutal. The order was to seize the land only. He didn't foresee what was going to happen. This was a failure that Ho Chi Minh made, by the way, and that's Luna's point. The failure was he did not foresee it, and he did not have enough control and oversight in the implementation, and that's what he apologized for. And this is a deeply personal story for Luna's family, and that apology was very important for Luna's family. By the way, Luna's grandfather never fled after this. He stayed in that village. His big mansion was partitioned up, the land was partitioned up, and he lived in like what used to be a warehouse until the day he died. A little tiny shack, basically. And he was content. He stayed and he helped try to rebuild after the revolution, even though he was tortured, even though he was attacked, even though his land was seized. And Luna and I both think, rightfully so, it is true that it was an exploitative relationship. It is good that they seized that land. We don't think that it's good that he got tortured, but regardless, he stuck around and he helped try to build socialism afterwards. Okay, so this is a very important, personal, traumatic story. Luna loved her grandfather. He was a real human being. And instead of engaging in this on any kind of human level, this is Vaush's reaction.
Wanted to take the land of rich people and give it to poor people, so everybody could have equal divisions of land.
He did a YouTuber Vaush.
He's so focused on his chat. I'm gonna let this play now because I'm gonna let this play. So disgusting to me. He's focused on his YouTube chat and the little jokes that they're making.
Lowercase. I'm sorry.
No apostrophe between the I and the O.
And in this, he's losing sight of the essence of the story, which is that Ho Chi Minh did not order the torture. He's doing this really great combination of just being a sick asshole who's responding to Luna's personal story about her family's actual suffering with like memes and jokes, but he's also distorting the essence of what actually happened. Because again, Ho Chi Minh did not order the tortures. And what he was apologizing for was simply not foreseeing that that would happen and not having more control. But now the whole chat's talking, oh, sorry about the torture, Logan politology, deep side before speech, right? They're not focused on what's actually being said, and so they get a distorted understanding of what Luna's saying. Now Vaush laughs hysterically for a very long time.
I didn't want to have to make this public ad. Yeah. No, this public address is demonetized, guys.
He doesn't understand what happened. He doesn't know what he's laughing at. He doesn't care. He doesn't care about the truth. He doesn't care about the essence. As a sophist, as a rhetorical trickster, he's just looking for little points that he can attack rhetorically, deflect, distort, misinform. That's what he does throughout this whole video. This is his reaction to the story of a Vietnamese woman talking about the torture of her grandfather.
Fuck. Okay.
But he didn't predict that the local communists and
It's all just
local
a joke.
peasants would take everything and even torture those rich people.
Maybe he should have factored in the material conditions. Unironically, though.
Ho Chi Minh found
This is Vaush. I'm going to end it here. This is a line in the sand for me, and Vaush crossed it, okay? This is disgusting. This is what Vaush thinks of people who actually lived through these experiences. For Luna, this is all not a hypothetical. Vietnam is the place she was born in. She has videos about growing up under the US embargoes, growing up under imperialism. Regardless of whether you think Vietnam is on the right track or not, Luna's a human being, and when she shares stories like this, deserves a basic modicum of decency and respect. This whole video, this whole reaction stream that Vaush did was disrespectful, dishonest, and demonstrated a clear lack of any awareness or understanding or knowledge of the things that are being discussed. The entire video goes along these lines. But I've shown you several examples of Vaush distorting the information, putting words in Luna's mouth, and just going on bizarre tangents to distract from what's actually being said. And this is what Vaush does for a living. And I know that there are members of Vaush's audience who are going to be super pissed that I made this video. And I know that I'm going to get harassed over this, because that's another thing about Vaush. There is an element of his audience, and you can see it in the chat, that's just disgusting. And this is the kind of, community that is cultivated by this kind of rhetoric, by this kind of analysis. If this is the movement that we build in the USA, in the West, whatever you want to call it, we're doomed to failure, because we cannot build our movement on a foundation of trickery and dishonesty and obliviousness to the essential characteristics of objective reality. We have to actually listen to each other. Luna has a lot of really valuable things to teach in her video series. There are 3 parts. Vaush only watched part 1. He barely paid attention, as you can see. I hope that you'll go and check out Luna's entire series and watch it in good faith and try to understand what she was actually saying without some buffoon mocking and distorting every single word that comes out of her mouth. Vaush has done nothing, especially in that last clip we watched, if not cool off the sympathies of his audience for the real people that live in Vietnam, like Luna and her family. And I'm going to end one more time with that point from Malatesta. For us to be divided, even when there are grounds for unity, would mean dividing the workers, or rather cooling off their sympathy, as well as making them less likely to follow the socialistic line common to both socialists and anarchists, and which is the heart of the revolution. It is up to the revolutionaries, especially the anarchists and socialists, to see this by not exaggerating the differences and paying attention above all to the realities and objectives which can unite us and assist us to draw the greatest possible revolutionary advantage from the present situation. When Vaush attacks people in the way that he attacked Luna, people who are working in good faith to try to educate people on philosophies which you may or may not find useful, but she is trying in good faith to present ideas that she hopes will have some value to the revolutionary movement. Vaush is exaggerating the differences and fabricating differences that don't exist. That is the essential nature of the sophistry and rhetorical trickery of Vaush. He is an eclecticist. He pulls ideas from anywhere that's convenient to suit whatever argument he's making at the time. He is a solipsist. He thinks that he can find truth through his own reasoning, through his own logic, which up to and including fabricating evidence, like for instance, saying that Luna's talking about class consciousness when she never made any mention of class consciousness. He is a sophist. He's only interested in displaying rhetorical prowess and picking apart rhetorical phenomena instead of trying to essentially grasp what's being said by people like Luna. I hope that if you watch Vaush regularly, that you take this in good faith and try to understand what I'm saying here and the problems that I have. I'm not saying you have to agree with Luna. I'm not saying Luna's right about everything. I'm not saying I'm right about everything. But it's very clear here what Vaush has done. And if you're comfortable with that and you find it acceptable, then that says a lot about you. And it says nothing about Luna. I'm tired of it. I'm tired of seeing the influence of this kind of sophistry on the left. I want our movement to be grounded in material reality, and I don't want us to exaggerate differences between each other. And I don't want us to look for division, for us to be divided even when there are grounds for unity. If Vaush addresses these things and truly makes amends, I'll consider it. But he's got a lot of damage that he's done, not just to Luna, but to many other comrades before I will trust him. That's not to say he can't change. And I don't think he will, but I hope that he sees what he was doing here and addresses it and cuts that shit out. And maybe he goes back and gives these ideas another view with maybe offline, maybe watch the videos offline and see what Luna has to say in good faith while actually focused and paying attention and not reading shitty chat comments and doing a million other things and trying to show off online. And I've recorded this offline, by the way. I didn't do it as a live stream because I wanted to focus on what Vaush is actually saying. But at any rate, yeah, I hope that Vaush might learn and grow from this. I do hope that. And I hope that his audience sees what's going on here as well. That's all I've got to say. I've tried to view this in good faith. I've tried to give credit where credit's due, where Vaush has been correct. But I can't let this blatant distortion, this attack, this hit piece, this assassination of truth stand. So that's all for now. I'm exhausted, I'm sweating, and I'm gonna go. And I'm EJ, this is NonCompete. See you next time.